The scale of the Tory crisis and the results of the election on the 8th of June have created a very widespread view that Jeremy Corbyn will be the next Prime Minister. One shouldn't assume these things, by the way. It requires a continuation of struggle, argument, of organisation to make sure that the Tories are driven from office as swiftly as possible and to ensure that Corbyn wins the next election. But it is a widespread view, and in some ways it runs counter to the experience across almost the whole of Europe. If you look everywhere else in Europe, parties like the Labour Party are doing poorly. In France, at the last presidential election earlier this year, the equivalent of the Labour Party, the Parti Socialiste, got 6.5% of the vote in the first round of the presidential election. An absolutely crushing defeat. In Germany, at the recent elections, the equivalent of the Labour Party, the SPD, got its worst result since the Second World War. In the Spanish state, PSOE, the equivalent of the Labour Party, is unable to get rid of the vicious, corrupt, brutal regime of Mariano Rajoy. And so on. In Greece, PASOK, the equivalent of the Labour Party, has virtually ceased to exist. Only in Britain is the Labour Party on the up, and it's a very clear example that what has motivated and inspired people is a radical set of policies and mobilisation of supporters on the streets. One of the key things about Corbyn's election campaign was the mass rallies of thousands of supporters which gave confidence to people and which put them into a position where they argued for people around them to vote for the Labour Party, combined with a manifesto that offered at least some prospect of real change, unlike that which had existed at the previous election, where Ed Miliband essentially offered austerity light. Corbyn was offering to end austerity and to bring about change for people. And this was crucial in terms of mobilising very large numbers. Okay, let's assume that Corbyn is going to win. I say we shouldn't just think this is inevitable. Let's assume that he is going to be. And there it will be. Jeremy will be there outside number 10 Downing Street, and it will be a massive boost for the whole of the left, because it will be a refutation of the idea that socialist ideas aren't popular. It will be an example that the left can actually win, which will be important, and it will be a turning of the page on a decade and more of the acceptance that austerity and the dictates of the market are the only way in which society can be run. It will be a refutation of the idea we always have to listen to the bosses and their supporters in the media. And therefore it will be very, very welcome. It's something that we in the SWP will organise for and fight for, just as we did during the last election campaign. And we hope that it will give people confidence to fight in their own workplaces, in their own communities, and in their own campaigns. In many ways, that's the most significant thing about a Corbyn victory. Of course we want to see the abolition of tuition fees. Of course we want to see £10 an hour minimum wage. Of course we want to see the renationalisation of the railways and of Royal Mail. Of course we want those things which Corbyn has pledged to bring about. But in many ways, the most crucial thing will be whether people feel more confident to take on the boss, to take on the manager, to take on the headmaster, whatever it may be. People feel stronger themselves to begin to take action. But what will definitely happen is that if Corbyn attempts to bring about really fundamental changes that begin to encroach into the realm of the bosses and of the state, he will face an avalanche of opposition. An avalanche of opposition. You can see it very, very clearly. That Morgan Stanley document that talks about Morgan Stanley are what's called wealth managers. That's people who enable people with lots of money not to pay taxes. Wealth manager Morgan Stanley says he is more of a threat than Brexit because why? It will end an era in which money has moved from labour to capital and will begin to move money the other way. Horror of horrors, it may mean that people at the moment who don't get paid very much will get paid a bit more. Appalling vista that these people might actually get a little bit more than they do at the moment. And they will not simply grind their teeth about this, they will begin to organise about it. And what I want to talk about is not, I hope it's not a demoralising analysis, it's an analysis of what we will face from the other side and what we have to do about it in order to resist. And I want to talk about international examples and examples in Britain. The strongest recent international example of that is Syriza in Greece. Syriza was elected in January of 2015 as the hope of a continent, a people who had been suffering under the yoke of austerity implemented by their own politicians, but also by the European Union, the European Central Bank and the International Monetary Fund, which had hurled society back 2 generations, where people were having their living standards cut by 15, 20, 25% and more, that suicide was reaching epidemic proportions, that the health service was falling apart. People had shrugged that off. And the new Syriza government went to the European Union and said, we're not going to continue with this regime, and you have to get rid of the debts which are being imposed upon us, which were racked up not by ordinary people, but by the bankers and the big corporations. The response from Wolfgang Schäuble, the German foreign minister at the time, finance minister, was elections cannot be allowed to change economic policy. In other words, you can vote as you like, but you can't actually implement the results of the voting. Yanis Varoufakis, who was the Greek finance minister at the time, retorted to Schäuble, what exactly is the point of having the elections? Wouldn't it be easier if you just appointed people to run the country? Probably a prospect that rather Schäuble thought was a good idea. Varoufakis then went on to say, I then began negotiating with all these people. I put forward all these clever plans, which I'd hoped that they would see were rational and so on, and in their own general interest. Varoufakis said, the response from them was, I might as well have been singing the Swedish national anthem, which I can't sing for you. I don't know whether I can sing the Swedish national anthem, but it made, in other words, they weren't even listening. They weren't even listening. They were determined Greece is going to have to continue with austerity, not really because it was about Greece, but because if Greece broke free from the austerity regime, then so might Spain, so might Portugal, so might Ireland, and so on. There would be an example put to people, you don't have to accept all this shit from the other side, and therefore they crushed them. Syriza's response was to put to the Greek people in a referendum in the middle of 2015, do you want to accept the cuts programme of the European Union? And people responded brilliantly, despite the threats and the intimidation and so on, in the great referendum, which became known as the Ochi referendum, the no referendum. People voted overwhelmingly to say, no, we don't. What was Syriza's response? Syriza was not going to break from the European Union. It wasn't going to leave the euro. It wasn't going to take a more radical turn and begin to take over the banks and the workplaces and so on, and therefore it capitulated. Within a week of the referendum, it had begun to impose policies worse than those of its Tory predecessor. And those who continued to fight back, like the pensioners protesting in Syntagma Square, for example, were met with tear gas and arrests. And we've seen subsequently, haven't we, the rounding up of asylum seekers, they're being put into detention camps and threatened with removal to the regime of Recep Tayyip Erdogan in Turkey, a brutal, vicious regime. And in a few days' time, on the 13th of December, there will be another general strike in Greece as a result of the policies that are being implemented. Okay, that's one example. That's one example. Maybe it was because Alexis Tsipras was a weak figure. Maybe it was because Greece was a particularly weak country. burdened by debt. Britain would be different to that. And of course, Britain would be different to that. What about François Hollande in France, elected in 2012 on the basis that we are going to get rid of the austerity regime? Described himself as the enemy of finance, and for a brief period began to implement some tax increases, some attacks on the bosses and improvement for working class people, to be met by a storm of investment strikes, destabilisation in the bond market. The bond market is the way by which governments borrow money, and the bond market, if it has no confidence in you, can raise the interest rates and make it more expensive for a government to borrow money. Destabilisation by the bosses, attacks in the media and so on. Within a period of 9 months, Hollande had capitulated and begun to implement policies which attacked the very people who had elected him, to increase the assault upon Muslims and migrants and the Roma in France, and as a result of this created a deep disillusion inside the working class, which opens the door to the further growth of the fascists of the Front National, with disastrous results, as we saw in the recent presidential election. The Front National was in the second round of the election and got millions of votes in, which have enabled it to strengthen its hold inside society. Now, what we learn from this is that capitalists do not play by the rules. Do not play by the rules. The fact that our side has won an election does not mean that we are then able to remold society simply as we want. Because the problem is power doesn't actually lie in Parliament. Great to have got a parliamentary majority, but it leaves untouched two crucial areas. The first is economics. The bosses are still in charge of the factories, the offices, the call centres, the mines, whatever it may be, and can use that economic power against an elected government. This is what they did in the example of Greece. It's an example of what they did in France. It's the example of what has happened in every previous Labour government in Britain. 1924, 1929, 1945, 1950, 1964, 1966, 1974, 1976, 1997, 2000, 1997, 2001, 2005. All of them, except for a brief period under Tony Blair, because he was doing what they wanted him to do, have felt ferocious resistance from the other side. Ferocious resistance. Again, let me give two examples. One is from the 1970s, when the government was elected, the Labour government was elected, on the basis that they would squeeze property speculators until the pips squeak. The idea was that the rich would really feel that they were being done over by our side, and they promised a fundamental and irreversible shift in the balance of power and wealth in favour of working people and their families. Quite a radical programme, actually more radical a programme than that which Corbyn would be elected on. The response, CBI Director General Campbell Adamson, CBI, you know, is the British bosses organisation, he admitted afterwards, we certainly discussed an investment strike. We also discussed various things about not paying various taxes and a list of things which in themselves would not have been legal. In other words, it was all put aside that we will destabilise this government by fair means and foul. We will use our economic power. What about the political power? Here a man helpfully, a man called Ian Gilmore, who was the Tory Shadow Defence Secretary at the time, wrote a book in which he said, majority rule is a device. Democracy is a means to an end, not an end in itself. If it is leading to an end that is undesirable, then there is a case for ending it. In other words, this democracy thing is all very nice as long as people vote the right way. If they don't vote the right way, then we will be forced to move outside democracy. And there are cases where we've seen this. It's what happened in 1973 in Chile, where the government of Salvador Allende, the quite gently reforming government, faced this pressure, began to mobilize people against it in a small way and tried to stand up against it. The result, a military took in and destroyed the government of Allende and led to the imprisonment, torture and death of tens of thousands of people on the left in Chile. It's what was attempted in Venezuela in a number of cases against the Chavez government as well. And we can guarantee it would be the same in Britain. It would be the same in Britain. It isn't to demoralise comrades, but the other side are not simply going to roll over and accept that things are going to go on as they are. There was a top general who said soon after Corbyn was elected Labour leader, there would be, if he began to get rid of nuclear weapons or to get out of NATO, there would be the possibility of a mutiny. It would be our duty to do these sorts of things because you can't interfere with that sort of items of what they regard as national security. So, what can be the response to this? There are two possible responses. The first is the other side will be nasty, the other side are very powerful, they've got the media, they have a lot of economic power, they have a lot of support in the state, among the police, the army, the generals, the top civil service, all of those areas in which there is no democracy at all. You can't actually vote who are judges, you can't vote who the police chief is, you can't vote who the general is, any more than you can vote about what's produced in the factory, to whom it's distributed, what the level of wages will be, and so on. So, they're very strong, let's compromise. Let's draw back and do things only so far as they will allow us to do them. This is the general response, in truth, of what the Labour Party has done in office. And there is a pressure on Corbyn to go that same way. I said, didn't I, that there was this serving general who told the Sunday Times there'd be a mutiny if Corbyn did various things. The truth is, the things that he talked about, Corbyn is not talking about doing anymore. The Trident nuclear weapons was part of Labour's pledge at the general election that they would continue with Trident nuclear weapons. The question of leaving NATO, the nuclear alliance, which binds the European countries to the US imperialism, Corbyn is not talking about withdrawing from NATO anymore. On the question of freedom of movement, Labour has abandoned support for the very, very limited, actually, rights of people to move freely to Britain within the European Union countries. You may have noticed that Corbyn made a very conciliatory speech to that CBI, that Campbell-Adamson organisation of which I spoke about in the 1970s recently, in which he said, we're not really enemies, we can be friends together. Well, the problem is the other side are not friends. They are capitalist sharks who are not bought off by any sort of concessions that you might want to make towards them. But this is a real road, the road of compromise. The alternative is mass mobilisation on the streets and in the workplaces in order to use our power against their side. And this is what we argue for. That starting tomorrow, because you can't wait until the moment itself actually comes, Labour and everyone on the left has to be organising to get rid of the Tories and to prepare for the inevitable response from the other side, and to make sure that Labour doesn't compromise when it's faced with that pressure from the top. And it will require mobilisation in the streets, it will require strikes, it will require occupations and so on. And in every small way that we can raise that now, with our anti-racist campaigning, with our support for strikes, with our support for those who are fighting back against the cuts, for those who are battling for frackers and climate change, all of that is part of preparing for what it would be like if there were a Labour government. You see, in 1970, I mentioned what happened in Chile in 1973. Actually, they tried to get rid of the government in 1970 in Chile. They weren't able to because tens of thousands of people came onto the streets and there were mass strikes. And because of this, the other side drew back. In Venezuela, in 2002, when they tried to get rid of Hugo Chavez, the response was not compromise, it was that people came out in their huge numbers from the favelas around Caracas, occupied the streets, pushed back against the army and so on, and saved Chavez when the army was threatening. And therefore, that's the example we have to take. It's not to say, I've seen this all happen before, Labour governments give in, Hollande gave in, Syriza gave in and so on. No. It is that there is going to be a clash, and we have to prepare now to move beyond simply working inside Parliament to say that the crucial arena of struggle is the streets and the workplace, and on the basis of this, we can go beyond simply tinkering with small elements of economic and political change and talk about a revolutionary transformation in which we have a deeper and richer form of democracy and ordinary people begin to run society. A final point. How can we overcome reformism, the idea that we have to do things through labour, in people's heads? In people's heads. Because reformism is in many senses an organisational expression of contradictory consciousness. By contradictory consciousness, I mean the idea that people have, which they absorb from the world around them, that on the one hand, we can collectively do things together, we can cooperate, we can make the world a better place, things can be better, we can get rid of racism and homophobia and transphobia and sexism and so on. We can do that, but come on, really the world's always been like this and always will be. And this consciousness, that's what contradictory consciousness is, in two ways. One, different people think different things. One person is a racist, one person is an anti-racist. That's true. But actually people hold these ideas simultaneously in their own heads. You must have met people who are very, very good. I support anti-racist struggles, but I don't like strikes. I think strikes are a bad thing. Or people who are very good, I love strikes, but are terrible about women's oppression or whatever. And people can simultaneously hold all these ideas in their head at the same time. And reformism is the expression of that politically. In other words, it says, yes, we can have a much better world, but only within the ambit of the system as it presently exists. And therefore, because you must do everything within this system, it means that you can't really go very far, because you will antagonise the other side, or you will begin to destabilise the system, which we require in order to produce the surplus which reformism can then distribute. This is the problem that can be overcome in a small way by argument, by experience, by showing people things. After all, that's what we're doing today. We are discussing and debating ideas, and that's very, very important. You know, we can win in Britain in 2017 thousands of people to this understanding of we can win a different world to revolutionary transformation, and socialism is possible, and we can tear out the roots of sexism and racism and so on. That's really, really important. To win hundreds of thousands of people that requires the experience of mass activity. The experience of mass activity which can show people in practice that a different world is possible, and they will learn about their own strength, their own power, and about who their enemies are and who their allies are in that struggle. It doesn't mean we sit and wait, oh, one day there'll be a big struggle and then things can change. Yeah, good. But what matters, of course, is when struggle is at a higher pitch, are there already socialists, revolutionaries who will argue for unity against racism, unity against sexism, and to not just stop at winning a parliamentary majority, but to push much further for a total transformation of the world that we live in Britain and internationally. And that's why what happens around a Corbyn government will be so important, because it will open up a whole number of political questions which have been closed for a very long time in Britain. How we're going to win fundamental change, what are the obstacles to it, and how we can mobilise politically, economically, but crucially in the streets and in the workplaces. And on the basis of the struggles that will form, the Corbyn government can be an opening towards a struggle that goes much further than that. Thank you.